In the late 90s, several years after the death of his brother DJ Subrock and subsequent demise of their group KMD, MC and producer Zev Love X had finally scraped together enough money to buy himself an Akai MPC 3000 sampler. He'd begun producing and performing again after disappearing from the hip-hop scene for 4 years, popping up at small venues and open mics with his face covered by stockings, bandages, or whatever else he could find. At these shows, Zev Love X would debut his new identity, a metal-faced supervillain called MF Doom. He would also debut some new songs, including a cut called Doomsday, the first known performance of which was in October 1998 at the New Yorkin Poets Cafe in Manhattan. By something I can only describe as a small miracle, not only did somebody happen to photograph him on that night, but somebody else happened to record his entire performance of Doomsday, keep track of that recording for decades, and eventually permit it to be uploaded to YouTube in January 2021, allowing us to hear the first known performance of the track, which includes what sounds like a live appearance from Pebbles the Invisible Girl on vocals. As you can hear, the beat is already in its finished state, albeit at a slightly faster speed. There could be a few different explanations for this, but either way I'll be remaking the beat at the speed of the album version. The next year, in 1999, Doom would crash at radio DJ and longtime friend Bobito Garcia's place for 3 weeks and borrow his MPC 3000 and MPC 2000 samplers to record his debut album, Operation Doomsday, which would be released in October of that year on Bobito's record label. The album Doom dropped would make little of a splash in the world of commercial hip-hop, but was lauded by the underground scene, many of whom recognized Doom from his KMD days. The opening track, Doomsday, seemed to have particular significance for Doom, being the track he personally chose to play from the album when interviewed on BBC Radio 1.
You want to play something from that record?
No doubt.
What should we play?
No, let me think. What's one of my... I would say the title cut.
Doomsday. You have to, really. Got to play that.
That's that joint.
Stone Cold classic.
Yeah. All right, yo. It's a super villain. Back at you. Y'all know how it is. This is Doomsday from the Doomsday record. Check it out.
Get Doomsday.
So the first thing I want to mention about this track is how deceptively simple the beat sounds. I went into this video wondering if this would even be an interesting enough beat to cover due to how simple it was. Like, it's just a loop with a couple variations, right? What's the big deal? Well, once I started remaking it, I pretty quickly realized how much more there is going on here than it seems. To put things into perspective, Doomsday is 30 4-bar phrases in length at 95.5 BPM. To recreate it, you need 25 different sequences, meaning that just 5 of the 30 4-bar phrases are duplicates. I was wondering for a while how I was going to present all this information, but I think the only real way to do it is to break down all 25 sequences one by one, so let's start at the beginning. The first thing we need to do is grab our samples, which come from just 2 songs. We'll get our melodic parts first, which come from the track Kiss of Life by Sade. An interesting thing about the main loop used is that it's actually the second half of one loop and the first half of another. The MPC allows you to set the loop point of a sample independent of the start point, which is most likely what Doom did. Now we need another part from Kiss of Life that's used more often in the song than you probably realized. This sample comes in after the first set of lyrics in the song. Those are the only 2 melodic parts we need, which means we can grab our drums now.
And the drums on Doomsday is poetry, BDP. So if you think about it, it's old school blends when, you know, DJs will blend a hip hop joint with an R&B joint. That's where that style comes from, you know what I mean?
So like Doom said, we're gonna pull our drums and scratch samples from Poetry by Boogie Down Productions. The first drum sample we need comes at the very start of the song. The other drum sample we need comes in at 1 minute and 50 seconds. Now we can grab our 2 scratch samples. The first one we want comes at 4 minutes and 45 seconds into the track. And the second one comes just before it at 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I've pitched down the Sade samples by 3 and slightly brought down the pitch of some of the Poetry samples. I've also set the resonance to 6 for each of the pads. and brought the filter frequency down to 95 for the scratches. We've got two copies of the main Sade loop, one of which mutes the alternate sample and the other doesn't. This'll come in handy later. The two drum samples also mute each other, which lets us switch between them on the fly. We've also got versions of the main Kiss of Life sample and the second poetry scratch that start halfway into their respective loops that we'll need for the outro of the song. Alright, now that everything's set up, we can finally start remaking the track. The first thing we need to do is sequence the false start intro of the song. We can use one of the copies we made of the main loop and just play it twice. And now we can start sequencing the real intro of the song. The first intro section consists of a plain loop of the Sade sample with the first poetry scratch played on the 4th bar. The next intro section already starts to introduce some variety into the main sample. We'll need to use the alternate Sade sample here on the last beat of the last bar. However, this creates a problem. Because the alternate sample doesn't start on a quarter note, it leaves a gap where the snare should go and sounds a bit empty. This is why we needed a version of the pad that doesn't mute the alternate sample. We can play the loop like normal and manually cut off the pad as soon as the snare ends to keep the beat sounding correct. Now we just need to add the second poetry scratch and we've got the last intro sequence. Alright, now we can get into remaking the verses of the song. The first sequence we're going to make also happens to be the most reused sequence in the track, being used for verse 1A and 2E as well as outro 3. It's pretty simple, just the regular Sade loop and the first poetry drums at the beginning of each bar. For the next section of verse 1, we start to bring some more variation into the drums. We'll alternate between the two drum samples for the first 2 bars, adding an extra 16th note on the second sample to make the kick pattern a little more consistent. We're now going to switch to only using the second drum sample for the next several patterns, so we won't have to touch the drums for a while after this. The pattern we need is basically the same as the first 2 parts of the last section played on just this pad. For the next section, we just need to add the second scratch sample over the whole pattern. This sequence will be reused later in the song for the B section of the 3rd verse. Now we're at the first chorus. This section is almost the same as the last, except we switch to the first poetry scratch for the last bar. Alright, now for the second verse. This verse is all about adding variation to the melodic sample while the drums don't really change much. For 3 sections in a row, we're going to introduce the alternate Sade sample a little bit earlier while the drums remain unchanged. For the A section, it comes in on the "and" of the 3rd beat of the final bar. In the B section, it comes in on the "and" of the 2nd beat in the same bar. And for the C section, we'll need to play it twice, once on the as in one E and of the first beat, and once on the and of the second beat, like the last section. So now for the D section, we'll switch back to the normal Sade loop and instead let the poetry drum sample play out fully on the last bar. The E section of the second verse reuses the A section of the first verse like I mentioned, so we can skip it and move on to the second chorus. For this section, we can actually just copy the B section of the second verse and change the drums to the first sample on each bar. As you heard, the alternate Sade sample was able to ring out there, which is what leads us into the break. The three sections of the break are really simple. The first is just the first drum sample on each bar. The second is the same thing with the second scratch layered on top. And the third section is the other drum pattern from the second verse with the scratch sample continuing. So now we're at the third verse, which is just three sequences. The A section is just the B section of verse 2 with the second scratch sample. The B section reuses the D section from the first verse, so we can skip it and move on to the C section, which has a unique drum variation not used anywhere else in the song. It's basically the C section of the first verse with the last drum hit removed. And now we're at the outro of the song. The first part uses the same melodic section as the second part of the intro, being the sequence that needed the other Sade loop pad. For the drums, we're going to let the second sample ring out in the second bar, then switch over to the first sample. The second and third outro sequences are taken from other parts of the song, so we'll skip to the fourth section, which is just the Kiss of Life loop on its own. For the fifth outro sequence, we need the Sade loop like the last section, but this time we'll bring in our copy of the second poetry scratch that starts halfway through on the last bar. The sixth outro section starts with the second poetry scratch and the Sade loop, but cuts the melodic part out on the of the third beat. The next section is pretty much the inverse of the previous one, starting with the second scratch and switching to the Sade loop halfway through. This is why we needed a version of the Kiss of Life loop that starts at the beginning of the actual sample. For the eighth outro section, we bring the drums back in, starting with the second drum sample and letting it play out on the third bar until switching to the first drum sample for the last bar. Alright, last two sections, but we've got a bit of a hurdle to jump now, because the second to last sequence of the song also happens to be the most complicated one by far. It took me quite a while to figure out what's going on here, but basically we're gonna play a really odd pattern with the two scratch samples that goes like this. This is another reason why we needed that other version of the second scratch that starts halfway through. And finally, we need just one sequence of the normal shoddy loop and first drum sample with the second poetry scratch underneath to fade out the song. And now, 25 sequences later, that is how you remake Doomsday with 100% accuracy. Alright, now we've got the finished beat remake here in Logic. Doom has stated in a few interviews that he tracked out the whole beat as one stereo track straight from the MPC during this period, meaning there were no separate stems, so that's what I've done here. I assume that he at least had some small amount of post-processing done to the track, so I've lightly added some EQ and compression, but nothing else. I want to say an extra special thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Patrons get early access to my videos now, as well as downloads of my full beat remakes and stems when they're available. If you're interested in becoming a supporter of me and my work, you can get exclusive access to all my Patreon content for just $4 a month, or you can get your name at the end of my videos for just $1 a month. Either way, I really appreciate you guys and all your continued support.